Our last presenter in this session is Rosaleen Duffy. Rosaleen is a professor at the University of Sheffield, Department of Politics, and she has established BioSec, which is Biodiversity and Security Program. This is with funding from the ERC, where she got an Advanced Investigator Award. Rosaleen will speak on political ecology of conservation and global security. Over to you.
Thanks very much. And thanks for the invite to talk today. What I want to do is talk a bit about political ecology, and actually I want everyone to keep in mind everything that Keith said, because he's gone into all the detail which I skipped for my talk, so it's great. It was a great setup for me. And I think the first thing I want to say is that conservation is and always has been political or geopolitical. There's been this recent security turn in parts of conservation. I'm not saying it's all conservationists everywhere in all places, but there is a definite security turn amongst some elements of conservation. And I think it's really important to place this in a wider historical context. So I want to use a sort of political ecology reading of conservation to tease out the multiple ways in which conservation and geopolitics can intersect. And from its inception, the conservation movement at the height of British imperial ambitions, to current responses to the illegal wildlife trade, geopolitics has infused conservation thinking and practice. And in fact, conservation has been part of and a key ally in three major global dynamics since the late 19th century: imperialism, capitalism, and now global security. So for today, I want to mostly focus on responses to the illegal wildlife trade because of the kind of sense of renewed urgency around the poaches in around the sort of spikes in poaching of some of the world's most loved species. But on the surface, I want to argue that on the surface, this is a story about conservation and this changing in a response to an emergency. But I'm currently writing a book that delves into these shifts and reveals how actually it's a story about capitalism, the security industry it sustains, and the powerful actors in the international system, and the fundamental restructuring of human relationships with nature. So the sort of political ecology approach, oh, sorry, I should have gone to that one. Political ecology, I guess political ecologists are kind of well-skilled in telling the stories that nobody really wants to hear. I found myself always to be the party pooper at various meetings. We look at the stories of injustices, of environmental struggles, of questioning and criticising dominant approaches. And what it focuses on is the sort of relationships between humans and the environment. They're central to political ecology. It's an interdisciplinary approach which brings together the concerns of political economy with ecology. We could say it's kick-started by Eric Wolfe in the early 70s and then by Blakey and Brookfield's classic study on soil erosion. Juan Martinez-Alés classically defined political ecology as the study of ecological distribution conflicts. And conservation, looking at conservation through this kind of lens of bringing together political economy with ecological concerns works very well to excavate how it's been an ally in these three major geopolitical dynamics of the past 100 to 150 years. And the first of those is imperialism. So the big NGOs of conservation were born at the height of British imperialism. Conservation intersected with colonisation. It's deeply implicated in the violent expansion of European and especially British imperial power, involving violent evictions, exclusions and continuing dispossessions that created areas for sport hunters and later for tourism, these kinds of wilderness areas which we're very familiar with in Africa in particular. Lots of authors have written on this, historians, political ecologists, John Mackenzie, Bill Adams, Jane Carruthers, Krishnan, Shivaramakrishnan, Liz Garland and others have all written about the birth of the Society of the Preservation of the Wild Fauna of the Empire and the role that European sport hunters have played in initial expeditions that led to British imperial rule, the sale of ivory and the use of meat from wildlife to feed those expeditions as the kind of imperial subsidy is what John Mackenzie calls it. Also, the establishment of the network of national parks has had that are very well known in sub-Saharan Africa, Serengeti, Virunga, Hwangi, Selous, were all created as idealised African wildernesses via the violent eviction of African communities. They produced the fortress conservation approach and created lands that had to and continue to be defended with considerable levels of violent force. And this history of shapes conservation and responses to conservation problems today. The allocation of land and resources for conservation in itself is a political decision. And some of those evictions to create those pristine wilderness areas are still in living memory for some communities and are maintained by their ongoing exclusion and dispossession. But the second sort of global logic or dynamic that conservation has also been involved in is capitalism. And in the 2000s, the big conservation NGOs were actively courting big business. They saw it as a new kind of source of funding, became enchanted with market-based approaches like carbon offsets, biodiversity offsets, payments for ecosystem services. And this means that they actually became actively engaged in the extensification and intensification of neoliberalism. Political ecologists have written extensively about this, teasing out the processes of the neoliberalisation of nature and why those logics had themselves produced the problems of biodiversity loss, and so they couldn't be used. The same logics that had produced the losses couldn't be used to prevent those losses. Myself, Dan Brockington, Bram Busher, Mano Ramutsindela, Frank Matosi, Kathy McAfee, Esteve Corvera. The list goes on. There's lots of us that have been working on this for a long time. And in favouring market-based approaches, the conservation NGOs that jumped on that bandwagon failed to sort of really tackle the underlying drivers of species loss, and that's the dynamics of global capitalism. The current system of global capitalism is ecologically unsustainable, as we heard from Kate Raworth this morning, and this is no longer a radical idea confined to green Marxists, political ecologists, degrowth movement. In fact, it started to be expressed very clearly by some unusual supporters, like transnational corporations at the recent World Economic Forum. So they said that, again, with absolutely no sense of irony whatsoever about their own implication in driving global environmental change. And the third area is the turn towards security in conservation, most recently around the illegal wildlife trade, and that's been my main focus for the last 2 to 3, possibly a little bit longer, years. And so I'll focus on that today. It's become harder and harder, I think, in some places and in some locations, to distinguish between what we would normally think of as conservationists and the people and practices that we normally think of as being involved in the security sector. Scientists are being replaced by security operatives trained in intelligence gathering, use of weapons and surveillance techniques. And the object of their gaze is not the plants and animals, but instead it's the humans that might threaten them. The illegal wildlife trade has risen to international prominence since the spikes in poaching of elephants and rhinos around about 2008 to 2010. And this has forged this kind of renewed sense of urgency in conservation, a call to do something before poaching and trafficking drive species to extinction. This sense of urgency then has produced a series of important conceptual and practical shifts in conservation, which demand much more thorough investigation and analysis. This new phase is characterised by pressing nature into the service of global security, opening up new opportunities for the security sector to engage in, to benefit financially and also to benefit in reputational terms from engaging in conservation. In debates about the illegal wildlife trade, this dynamic is wrapped in a sort of narrative of using security to save nature, which Keith set out very well just beforehand. But this narrative is deeply problematic and is changing what conservation is and what conservation could be in the future. So what I want to do in the book, and I'm not going to go into all the material that's there to kind of support the arguments, I'll just present the arguments today, is that when conservation becomes integrated with security concerns, conservation gets relegated to second place and security will win out. The dominant response to the illegal wildlife trade means that conservation itself has become a useful ally, sometimes unwitting, but sometimes fully aware, in the security strategies of some of the world's most powerful actors at national and global scales. And conservation can provide then a cover for other motives, from states in particular, from governments, a convenient excuse, amongst other things, to quell or evict resistant populations, to open new markets to the private sector, and to open new markets for tech companies, allowing militaries and allow them to justify greater allocation of resources to themselves with very little oversight from the public. So these kinds of imperatives of conservation and of security, I think the imperatives of the two can be very, very different indeed. The central and urgent question of conservation is, in the illegal wildlife trade, is to prevent species declines and losses as a result of unsustainable use. By contrast, the imperative of security, in very traditional terms, is to prevent and tackle threats to global and national stability. With the end of the Cold War came the growing concern with kind of new security threats like human and animal disease, biological weapons, religious differences, mass population displacements, climate change and pollution. And environmental debates, this became very closely associated in international relations with a kind of the environmental security perspective as espoused by Thomas Homer Dixon, which focused on kind of simple scarcities leading to violent conflict. And it might appear that the illegal wildlife trade and the threats it poses, they might appear as an ideal example of a new security threat, which fits neatly with established and mainstream environmental security thinking. But for me, this is a really impoverished view, which doesn't really capture the richness and depth and significance of the changes being reaped in conservation by its integration with security. The imperatives of security and conservation are very different, and it's not clear or obvious at all why they should be fused together. So I think we need to look at what happens when they do get fused together. One of the key questions there is, how was this done, or how has it been done? And one of the first things is it's been done through a reframing of the illegal wildlife trade as a global security threat by making two different sets of arguments. There's been this kind of critical shift that the illegal wildlife trade is a wildlife crime and a serious crime carried out by organised criminal networks, by organised crime groups. Second, by arguing that the trade is used as part of key funding strategies for non-state armed groups, militias, rebels, terrorist groups of the kinds that Keith talked about just beforehand, the LRA, Janjaweed, Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, all of them the big kind of bogeymen for powerful Western governments. So what's this produced on the ground, and why do we need to be worried about it? It produces a certain type of logic on the ground. The imperatives and framings are affecting practices in conservation. Approaching the illegal wildlife trade as a security issue prompts a security-type response, rather than one anchored in, say, development or community-based natural resource management, or even conservation biology. The shift towards security thinking, I think, has encouraged the entry of security sector actors into conservation, often seeking new markets for their training packages, their weapons, their surveillance systems, and so on. It embeds and deepens further engagement of private sector operators, the private sector security companies, which globally have simply sort of segued into being seen as acceptable and cheap alternatives as they've been used in interventions in the Middle East for several decades. So, in places where there's intense concern that poaching will drive the extinction of iconic species, it's also facilitated the militarisation of conservation. And militarised forms of conservation are carried out by a complex mix of states, the private sector and conservation NGOs. And I don't particularly at this point in the talk, but I can talk about it later in the break, want to get into a debate about good and bad militarisation. For me, I want to question an approach that's based on the logics of militarism and seeing people as the enemy. For many of the world's most vulnerable people, militarised conservation looks, feels and is experienced as dispossession, violent eviction, exclusion, torture, rape and murder. I won't call them revelations about the brutality of WWF trained and funded eco-guards. They're not revelations, it's been well known for years. Lots of us have been trying to draw attention to it for a very long time. Two NGOs, Survival International and Rainforest Foundation UK, have written extensive reports that have all been sent to all the funders that are now saying, we never knew about this, but the reports were sent to them. Many in conservation as well, I think, have been turning a blind eye or excusing it by making the argument that there's a few rotten apples in the barrel, instead of understanding it and recognising it as the outcome of systemic problems. It's more than just the militarisation of conservation as well. The security sector, including standing armies and private military companies, are also using conservation as an arena for developing and trialling new warfare techniques. Therefore, the integration of conservation and security isn't all one way, it's a two-way exchange. And I turn to one example, which is the British Army training for anti-poaching in Malawi. It's one of the more spectacular and high-profile examples, but I want to stress that much of the rest of the convergence of security and conservation is sort of creeping, everyday and mundane. It's the ways that philanthropic donations come from the kind of tech giants are funding the development of algorithms, drones and subsoil metal detectors for anti-poaching, or the use of AI and deep learning to uncover online trading of illegal wildlife products by organised crime networks. So the military training side of things is the spectacular example, but there are lots and lots of others that one could use. It's a flagship project. The recent deployment of UK troops on anti-poaching projects in both Malawi and Gabon have attracted a lot of media and public attention. They provide very good news stories for the British Army, for the governments of Gabon and Malawi, as well as for the UK, and for the NGOs involved. It's a two-way exchange of knowledge between conservation and the military, and there are wider implications, I think, of following this path. The UK has stepped up its commitments to tackle the illegal wildlife trade, committing new funding and organising 4 high-profile international conferences. But this has become one of the kind of one of the things where there's kind of a lot of media and public interest. The genesis of the Malawi and Gabon deployments is quite different. In the case of Gabon, it was the result of a request from the President of Gabon via Prince Charles to the British government for support in anti-poaching using the Boko Haram argument. And the deployment in Malawi came about because of a particular individual in the Ministry of Defence who was really keen to kind of apply the lessons that they'd learned while they were operating in Afghanistan. And as a result, a small team from the Yorkshire Regiment went to Malawi in 2017, and in conjunction with the Malawi Department of Parks and Wildlife and a private entity, the African Parks Foundation, they began the kind of counter-poaching training. It's been supported on the UK side by Tusk Trust and by the government's Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund, which is DFID money but administered by DEFRA. And it's important, I think, to place this in a kind of a wider context and not just in the framework of an urgent response of how to respond to the illegal wildlife trade. It's a part of the search for a new role for the military amid significant cuts in funding and radical restructuring of the UK armed forces. It can be seen as part of the Strategic Defence and Security Review, and the deployments for Ranger training in Africa can be seen as kind of trying to demonstrate how adaptable and important the role of defence is in supporting government policy across the world and extending British power. So, to conclude, It's reasonable to ask why any of this should concern us, and is there a case for seeing the illegal wildlife trade as a security issue if it does indeed threaten species with extinction and contributes to national and global security? And I think on the surface, the threat it poses to stability may appear to be an example of a kind of a new security threat. But the security imperatives, framings and logics will mean that security will tend to win out. And this is problematic, I think, because it acts as a very serious distraction. Taking the security approach to illegal wildlife trade ultimately won't solve the problem. It might save a few plants or animals in certain locations. It might even prevent an extinction or two. But all of this is important and should not be overlooked. But the underlying pattern of species loss will continue. And that's because the security-oriented approaches distract from dealing with the actual drivers of extinction and reduced numbers of animals and plants. It sidesteps the ways that the dynamics of global wealth and inequality produced by a wider system of capitalism drives the trade in the first place. Wrapping conservation in a security framework has produced a cloak for wider forms of surveillance, monitoring of people, animals and ecosystems at one end of the spectrum, and at the other end of the spectrum facilitates and encourages violent enforcement strategies, including exclusion, human rights abuses and use of deadly force. And as this approach continues to develop in conservation, we need to ask ourselves, is this the sort of conservation we want when it's not going to address the fundamental drivers of why species are being lost? Thank you.
Thank you, Rosaleen. Time for questions here at the front row.
Very interesting. I've been in the sort of humane conservation world for about 40 years now. And one of the things you find is that donors react very strongly to animal rescue. And that's what I'm seeing, is that this militarization issue is very attractive to donors. I don't care whether they're big corporations or individuals. The big wealthy donors want to give $1 million to save this. And that's as much part of driving this as any corporate interest is. I mean, that's why you're getting World Wildlife Fund and the others doing this sort of stuff.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that. And I think there is a long section in the book that donors, be they donors like DFID or DEFRA, donors like DFID or DEFRA or the big tech giants bear an enormous amount of responsibility for having funded this in a very unquestioning way. So I completely agree with you. I don't think that takes away from I don't think that takes away from the argument that it's really problematic to put security and conservation together, but certainly donors have a big responsibility here.
Thank you. I just want really to commend your presentation. I think the fact that you first of all really put it in a historical context, really for me, it really fits in also with the geopolitical approach, because I would say contrary to the previous presentation, which was maybe addressing the issue of Chinese, but I'm not going to get into the Road and Belt issue, even though I've lived 16 years in China and might have other views on that one. I wanted just to highlight maybe two information which complement what you're saying. There are two countries in Africa. Their names alone reveal what, at that time, some of the European empires used to do in Africa. One of them is called Gold Coast. So when you call Gold Coast, which is called Ghana today, why it was called Gold Coast? Because it was the coast where you could go and just collect gold, and definitely not for the Africans. And then the other one was called Ivory Coast. Today you go to Ivory Coast, you won't find any elephants. Where were they all gone, and who was doing the poaching then? So while we're addressing what is happening today, I will say it is important that each individual also situate yourself we talk about really civilizations, you know, they come and go, they implement this, and they have taken away certain things. It is important to situate things so that when you present yourself, you are not painting yourself as being innocent. You see what I mean? So I think that's maybe one of the parts that I wanted really to comment in some of the presentation. Yes, there are issues. Yes, there are certain countries that are doing a lot of issues within the African continent. But are we innocent, the ones that are presenting it? And so self-examination at the same time also then presenting an orientation and solutions that are rising above the nationalistic or the superpowers, but becoming more universal in the way we are addressing and approaching issues. And I'm addressing it in particular also in the case, I have nothing against or for the Chinese, but I would just say that the way it was presented is almost like that was the only evil that is really happening in the African continent. When we have oil company doing similarly, the reason we have immigration is because there are certain policies imposed in some of those countries that are causing other factors. And we can really chain actually all the issues down to conservation, but emanating beyond the looting and poaching that we are exercising is part of poverty. Why do we have the explosion of this terrorist group? Because there's poverty and those young people are easily being recruited to join them. Why? So, you know, when we start asking those questions, the chain becomes a little bit long. It's not really just that very clear shortcut. You know, it is quite a... So we need to, yeah, let's do a very thorough investigation. I think that's the role of universities. Let's be very holistic when we are really doing the approach, and I congratulate you for your approach. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I mean, obviously, I completely agree, and I think we do need to place it in historical context. And I think one of the potential risks of an event like this is that there may be an attempt to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of us who've been working on the politics of conservation or geopolitics and conservation for a very long time, and sort of building on that work and recognising that there is a historical context to the dynamics that we see today. As you say, ivory poaching didn't come out of nowhere, and if you look back to the sort of late 19th century and early 20th century, an ivory poacher would have been a coloniser. Most definitely, and African forms of hunting would have been criminalised deliberately in order to sort of enclose those resources for European sport hunters and for Europeans. So absolutely, I think it's really important to talk about colonialism, to talk about history, to talk about capitalism, neoliberalism and global security, and not pretend that all of these dynamics exist in some kind of vacuum.